Hi, for this little video session I thought I would show you some of the mode controls on a digital SLR camera, what they do and how they work and what they mean. I'm using a Nikon digital SLR camera for this, but I'm sure if you've got a Canon digital SLR or a Sony or another make, what I'm about to show you will work for that as well. And also apply to a lot of the top end and more expensive digital compact cameras and the bridge cameras you can buy. If you're not quite sure how the controls of your camera work, I always think it's a good idea to look at Google on the internet, because somewhere out there there'll be a user group of people who've bought the same camera as you have and are struggling, like myself maybe, on what some of the controls will do, and have set up a user group. Go to Google, put in your camera make and model number, user group, and do a search, and I'll bet you'll find something there that may help you. This is the information screen on a Nikon D200. Here is the on-off button and shutter button. Here is the mode button, and this button allows me to compensate for the exposure. But in the meantime, we're just going to concentrate about some of the information given away in this screen here. If I turn the camera on, you will see we get various little pieces of information up in here. At the moment, this particular camera has 83 shots left on this card. That's the battery indicator. It tells me how much strength's left in the battery. This is the mode, which is the purpose of this little talk, and we'll go into that a little bit deeper later on. This is the file type. By moving that, I can change the file type. I'm first of all going to check the ISO of the camera. If I click on that, turn this button here, can you see how the numbers are increasing and decreasing? This is the relative sensitivity of the sensor to light. The higher the number, the more sensitive the camera is to light. In other words, the quicker it will record light. This is useful in low light situations. For this little exercise, I'm going to leave it set at its lowest at 100. Okay. If you notice, it's set to M, which is manual. What this means is that I can actually control the aperture and the shutter speed of the camera. If I turn this button here, can you see how the aperture here changes? If you watch, there we go, can you see that? If I change that one, that's the shutter speed changing. So we've got 80th of a second, 100th of a second, 125th, 500th, back down to 8th of a second, 8 seconds, 5 seconds. There we are, into seconds there. There we go, that changes it up and down. This is the aperture. If I change the aperture, it's going to f16, 22, change it back up again. Can you see that, how it's changing? So this gives me the control of changing the aperture and the shutter in the camera totally under my own control. The camera will do what I tell it to do. If you notice this little slider moving up and down, this is measuring the exposure. Can you see that? So if I go that way it's underexposed. If I go that way, it becomes overexposed. You see that? So for example, if I set it there at 100th of a second, I can then use this one to bring it down, to change the f-stop, to give me a nice mean exposure. Okay, we'll change mode now. I press this button here, and that allows me to go to P, S, A, and back to M. So we've got manual, program, shutter, and aperture. We'll leave it on aperture for the time being. If you notice, the aperture is set to f5 while the shutter speed is set to 100th. If I move the aperture and adjust it, can you see how the shutter speed is changing? I'm adjusting the aperture, but it's also changing the shutter speed. Okay, can you see that? So as the aperture, the number gets higher, in other words the hole in the lens gets smaller, the shutter speed gets slower. Can you see that? So one is indirectly linked to the other. Or should I say one is directly linked to the other. You see that? So by adjusting the aperture, I'm actually changing the shutter. If I go on the mode and go back to shutter, and this one here controls the shutter, if I adjust the shutter, can you see how it's controlling the aperture? So aperture priority controls the aperture And when you move the aperture, the camera will choose a shutter speed. With this particular mode, I change the shutter and the camera chooses an aperture. If I go to program, then what actually happens is none of these particularly work, in that the camera then will actually literally choose what it thinks is the correct aperture and shutter speed for any shot I'm taking. If I go back to the shutter here, you will notice it gives it the S. Some cameras will give you the letter T or a TV, which means time value. It basically means the same. The shutter is the length of time we allow the light to go into the camera. Okay, we adjust that. We change the shutter. We're changing the length of time the light goes into the camera. We go to aperture, and we're changing the amount of light that goes into the camera. Okay, can you see that? Changing one. Go back to shutter. Changes the other. Can you see that? So don't forget, shutter, you move the shutter, the camera will choose the aperture. Aperture, you change the aperture, the camera chooses the shutter. Manual, you choose either, and with program, the camera chooses either. It's quite simple really, isn't it? Thank you.